Co is hallo?
Bestuur zeker wegen them.
良い一日を。
Two outlaws on the lam, taking the back roads through America.
You can't drink enough coffee for this show.
And now it's time for Monday Madness with the Moped Outlaws, Greg and Mark.
Welcome to another episode of Moped Outlaws. Wish I could be more exuberant at this moment. But unfortunately, we've had a last minute cancellation from today's guest, Dr. Marlene Carson, who is really deeply involved in something called Black Leaders Against Sex Trafficking, and a woman of color who has gone from being just a survivor to being someone who's making a huge impact in the world. And Greg and I wanted to still get on and have a little conversation about sex trafficking and about violence against women and how important it is for us as a culture and as people, and in particular men, to actually be willing to have insight into this conversation and take on some of the labor of fixing this, because violence against women and sex trafficking against women and women of color in particular is rampant, and it doesn't get the coverage it deserves. And we're not going to ignore it. We're not going to sit back and just, make jokes instead. We're going to actually have a little conversation.
And Dr. Carson will join us. There was an act of violence that was very close to her life that occurred last night, and so she let us. So she was willing to come on, and she also hasn't been asleep at all. So Mark and I said, why don't we meet up at a different time?
Yeah. And so our heart goes out to everyone affected by that incident, and to Dr. Carson and the people that she works with. You know what? One of the things that came up for me, Greg, is I was talking to my partner this morning about how we're going to have this conversation, and she reminded me how just every woman deals with what we'll call energetic assault all the time. Like, they worry about what they wear, they worry about how they're going to be, whether they're going to be safe on the street, and they're constantly being, approached, even subtly. Like, she described a scenario where she was at the grocery store and she could feel someone just kind of checking her out from behind. And one of the things that I wanted to bring to the table, and we'll bring up again when we have our guest, Dr. Carson, back, is this idea that men have to do something about this.
Yeah, and for me, it's tricky because sex, like even just the word has a charge for me that's a titillation. And like you could say sexual assault, and because the word sex in it, not all the time, but sometimes there's this animalistic titillation I feel in my body just from the term sex. And I think part of what we need to master is that arousal state. Like thinking with your dick, I think is really talking about how there is an element with sexual energy that when unmastered, one loses control. And I think that's where a lot of the violence comes from.
Yeah, I think that's a gateway for sure, because the very first impulse control is one of the big keys. But there's also the context where we just have so much that we allow as a cultural context, where we just don't hold each other accountable about behaviors that are considered the word is locker room behavior, as if it's somehow benign when it's behind closed doors. And so we can't ignore how significant this is for women. And as men, the work to be done is, as you say, learning to be able to respond instead of react. Because biologically, I think it's true. We are designed to react very quickly to sexual stimuli, and it's part of our makeup. But that's not an excuse or a justification for being leaky in the way that we approach how we interact with women. And
I believe that it's easy to think we're going into some stoic, cold, dead thing like that. Then I don't believe any of us, even your partner, that's not the world we're asking for. On this wandering I just did, I went to a 21 and over circus, and there was a burlesque element to it. And there's a lot of fun and play in that sexual energy of burlesque, and everyone had a great time. And part of what I like your term leaky. Like, there was no leaky. For one, everyone involved had given permission. We were in a permissive environment, and everyone. See, when I say was on best behavior, like, there was yelling and hooting and flirting and all sorts of fun stuff, and it was appropriate.
Yeah, context in this case means a lot, and there's a line that we play with around what is consent. And I think when we're talking about casual social interactions that are public, where men still have these impulses, but they're not necessarily holding space for someone else's safety, in places like grocery stores and movie theater lines and bars and things like that, where, we have this blurred concept of what's permissible and what's not. And what we're finding out more and more from women as they tell their stories of how their lives are experienced, that we don't understand. Men think one thing, and it's not the case that it's safe for women in this environment and in the way things are unfolding. And I think when you have consent, i.e., everyone knows they're going to a burlesque show, there's a level of calibration of energy that goes in there. But even in such a thing, there's the possibility of overstepping, right? Because just because a woman is acting a certain way and has a certain dress as a performer does not entitle us to press the limits, to push beyond those boundaries even in that context. And I don't think men are good at having a strong self-control over those impulses. It's like once things start ramping up, we get less and less calibrated to the situation. And the thing about this is, men, if you could calibrate appropriately, you would actually have richer relationships, because women would feel safer around you. And the way that their intimacy works, the way that connection works for them, both physically and emotionally, would open up. But they're walking around having to defend themselves at every corner, and it's a subconscious thing. The vigilance center in women in the Western culture is always very high, and I don't think it's healthy for anyone.
Yeah, and I would caution that we don't generalize. Like, there's some women who are very playful and appreciate flirting and being checked out, and there's some women that feel attacked by it. And I think maybe part of, like, for me, well, I think I have my own personal fears about being really flirty and that kind of energy. So I'd say that's for me to work out, but don't work it out appropriately. I guess that's it, like the appropriateness. Like, part of what you and I learned to know is the individualization of an individual. What the fuck am I saying? But how, like, not only is an individual unique, but the moment's unique as well. Like, this moment might be no is appropriate. And I think for men, one of the hardest things to learn is to accept the no right when you hear it. There you go. We're done. Move on. And that could be just a pleasant moving on.
Yeah. And when it comes to sex trafficking, one of the things that's real is that the market, the demand, the buyer is what's driving it.
Yes.
And so the best way to deal with that is to deal with why men want to do this. What is it about us that thinks it's okay and that feels like it's reasonable? And, you know, money makes things too easy in some instances. And in this case, it goes all the way back to the slave trade and male entitlement. And I think we are the solution. You know, a lot of the work is coming from women who are dealing with this stuff, especially around repair and creating safe spaces and healing spaces for women who are victims of sexual crime and energetic sexual crime. And the part that doesn't get talked about enough is what we as men need to do. Even if you aren't someone who's ever even come close to, you know, being involved in a situation where you could be supporting sex trafficking, you know, there's a lot of guys who look at porn and they don't know whether that woman is being coerced or not, or has been, you know, kidnapped or not. We just don't know. And so the healing begins with us.
Yep.
And I'm telling you that the frustration that seems to drive most of men's reliance on these sorts of things, where they're buying sex or they're looking for porn, that frustration could turn into connection if we figure this out. Women actually want love and connection and sensuality at a root level, but we don't make the world safe for them. The male gaze, the patriarchy, all of these things are not functioning well, and we have to do something about human trafficking. And I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to talk more in depth and get Dr. Carson's perspective on this, and us being able to ask her, you know, insightful questions. I'm sure there's tons of information that we don't have access to. If you want to participate, if you're hearing this, feel free to send us email at thehosts@mopedoutlaws.com. And if you have questions for Dr. Carson, we'll ask your questions. If you send an email to us, we'll get them asked. And we need to have this conversation more than just once.
Yeah, so we will reschedule with Dr. Carson, and in the meantime, we'll be doing our best to be part of the healing solution.
Yeah. And you can too.
Recording stopped.